This evening for the second session of IPPNW's Global Classroom. My name is Molly McGinty. I am the Program Director at the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, IPPNW, and I'm going to facilitate today's session. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Please remain muted throughout the session today. We'll have time at the end for Q&A when you can unmute, share any thoughts with the speakers and any questions you might have, or you can put those in the chat throughout the duration of the event and I will note them. Feel free to have your cameras on or off. I think it's wonderful to see who we're speaking to. So if you're open to it, please have your camera on. And again, you won't be in the recording as long as you're not speaking. We come to the Global Classroom with a baseline level of respect for one another. We know that we're coming from many different places, many different foundational experiences, and with different knowledge levels. So come with an open mind and come ready to ask questions, no matter how long you've been in this space or if you're brand new. Today, we're going to learn about the disproportionate and long-lasting humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. If you missed the launch in the first module on Nuclear Weapons 101, I encourage you to watch those as soon as you can. The Global Classroom is a 10-month-long virtual education program designed to prep all of you to go out into your communities and and onto the international stage, ready to push back against the deadly norms of nuclear weapons and, most importantly, advance their elimination. This is a moment of uncertainty. It's a moment of fear, and it's a moment where we really need everybody here to take action. We need everybody to spread the word about these inhumane weapons. And all of that must be based on sound evidence and collective action. So today we're going to learn about the foundations of not just IPPNW's work, but the reason behind the first UN resolution, on the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the Ban Treaty, and much, much more, along with all of the movements of civil society and states that have made all this progress possible. And that's on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. Today is going to be a sort of overview discussion, and in future conversations, we'll learn more about impacts on infrastructure, radiation exposure, and more. So today, I really encourage you, take out a notebook, take out something physical, and take notes, because this will be the foundation of all of our future conversations. Thank you again for being a part of this. And with all of that said, we are going to get started. So today, we are joined by Ghee and Dr. Joe Hodgkin. They're going to give a presentation for the next 20 to 30 minutes, I believe, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So Ghee Lee is a medical student at Ohio State University College of Medicine. She has a BS from Carnegie Mellon University and a master's degrees in immunology at Harvard Medical School and music education at the Boston Conservatory at Berkeley. He is a dedicated advocate against war and nuclear weapons and currently serves on the National Board of Physicians for Social Responsibility, which is the U.S. affiliate of IPPNW. She collaborates with medical students through IPPNW, supporting initiatives to promote physician engagement in nuclear disarmament efforts. Her published work include articles in the AMA Journal of Ethics and in Medical Conflict and Survival. These works offer a framework for physicians and medical students to address the public health consequences of nuclear war and mitigate the risks of nuclear conflict. So as you can hear, she's the perfect fit today to give us an overview of the humanitarian impacts of these weapons. Our second speaker today is Dr. Joe Hodgkin, who is an attending hospitalist physician at Massachusetts General Hospital and an instructor in medicine at Harvard Medical School. As a member of Physicians for Social Responsibility, IPPNW, and Back from the Brink, he's involved in medical and peer education about the health effects of nuclear weapons, youth and medical trainee engagement, lobbying for disarmament and de-escalatory nuclear policy, and physician track 2 diplomacy to promote peace in the medical and scientific community, physician audiences, medical trainees, and at the 2022 Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. So again, two really wonderful speakers that we have here today. Please, Ghee, why don't you take it away?
Sounds good. Let me share my screen. I'm going to start my presentation mode. Can you all see the screen? Perfect. Thank you, Molly, for the kind introduction. And it is wonderful to be here and talk about what we can do about nuclear weapons and the advocacy work against them. So today I'll be speaking the first half of the presentation, and then Dr. Hodgkin will talk the second half. So there are many weapons out there in different forms. They're all destructive. They can take lives, they can inflict harm on other people. But today we will focus on nuclear weapons, specifically how nuclear weapons are different from other weapons. And I will talk about how nuclear weapons are unique in terms of their scale of destruction and radiation. And later, Dr. Hodgkin will talk about how they're different from other weapons in terms of their global climate effects and their purpose. So before I talk about the scale and radiation, I think it's important to start with the basics. I think understanding the difference between nuclear reactions and chemical reactions will give us the foundation for understanding how nuclear weapons are different from other forms of weapons. So this is going to be a little bit of chemistry 101, but again, I think this will set us up for success. So every material
Material
is
is
made up of tiny particles called atoms. And every atom has at its core called a nucleus, made up of neutrons and protons. And surrounding that, sorry, let me pause 1 second. I can hear myself.
I think you should be good.
Okay. I'll keep talking. So again, every atom has a nucleus at its core, and around the nucleus has electrons that are orbiting. And the distinction that I want to make between nuclear reactions and chemical reactions is the difference in terms of the amount of energy associated with them. So nuclear reactions are used in nuclear weapons, and chemical reactions are used in other explosive weapons. Now, when we talk about chemical reactions, we're talking about breaking or forming bonds between the electrons, and the energy associated with it is relatively small. But when we talk about nuclear reactions, we're talking about splitting or forming nuclei, and that is associated with a lot of energy. We're talking an immensely, like astronomically higher amount of energy. And that difference makes nuclear weapons different from other weapons because of the sheer amount of energy associated with it. So that is one difference that I want to point out. And another difference is what comes out of these reactions. So radiation comes out of nuclear reactions. I'm talking about alpha, beta, gamma rays. They are destructive. They can penetrate through our bodies and damage the DNA strands. Out of the chemical reactions, we get heat and or thermal energy, and they're so destructive, but they have different qualities or properties, not as destructive as the rays that I just talked about. But the thermal energy can still cause burn and harm human. Another thing I want to point out is that there are two different kinds of nuclear reactions. Again, both involve an immense amount of energy. One is fission reaction, where you are splitting the nucleus, where you're spitting out more neutrons, creating this like chain of reactions. Again, lots of energy can be generated. Another nuclear reaction is called fusion reaction, where you're combining two different kinds of nuclei, and that process generates a lot of energy. Now, early nuclear weapons relied on fission reactions only, but as the nuclear weapons became more sophisticated, advanced, they now rely on both the fission and fusion reactions, making even more energy. So they have become a lot more destructive than the nuclear weapons developed earlier. So we've established that nuclear reactions can generate a lot of energy. And I want to put this into some perspective, um, especially when we're trying to compare different weapons to nuclear weapons. I think it's important to give us some number to understand. And people came up with this unit called a ton of TNT. A little bit of background about TNT. It is a highly explosive material that is used in a lot of explosive bombs. And once detonated, it undergoes a chemical reaction, as you can see here. As a result of this chemical reaction, it generates a lot of gases and heat. So it is destructive. But people have come up with this unit called a ton of TNT as a unit of energy released by the megagram of TNT, or 1,000 kilograms of TNT. Now, that is a lot of energy, and that is a lot of explosive materials we're talking about. And I have included some examples of explosive bombs and how much energy they're capable of generating. So, for example, Mk-84 bombs, they are frequently used in many different wars, like in Vietnam War, and even in recent years in Gaza, they've been used. And each bomb is capable of generating zero point 0.5 ton of TNT. Um, Now, another non-nuclear bomb called mother of all bombs, it is one of the most destructive, again, non-nuclear bombs that exist in the US arsenal. And it is capable of generating 11 tons of TNT. And I also included the Beirut explosion that happened in 2020. As you can see in the picture, it was a huge explosion as a result of igniting ammonium nitrate. And that incident, that explosion is estimated to generate about 500 tons of TNT. Now, with these numbers in mind, let's compare them to the energy generated by nuclear weapons. Now we're talking, again, the same units, but in a different scale. You can see here, Hiroshima bombing, that generated about 15 kilotons of TNT. Again, it's a different scale of energy that we're talking about. And the nuclear weapon that dropped in Nagasaki generated about 20 kilotons. And as you can see, the Tsar Bomba, it's a most destructive thermonuclear weapon that ever detonated in history. It happened in 1961 by the Soviet Union, and that generated about 50 megatons of TNT. So again, just giving you some perspective into the difference in terms of the scale of impact these weapons are capable of generating. I also want to point out that today, the nuclear weapons that the United States and Russia have, they're capable of generating like hundreds of kilotons of TNT, which are like tens and hundreds times bigger and destructive compared to the nuclear weapons dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So again, they're getting more destructive, they're getting more advanced, and capable of generating a lot more energy. And these are some pictures of like what happens after nuclear bombing in Hiroshima. You can tell it literally destroys everything. And again, the current nuclear weapons that we have are far more destructive than what they were capable of back in early 20th century. I also mentioned this simulation tool called NukeMap, developed by Dr. Wellerstein. It allows you to see the scale of impact that any nuclear weapons can have in major cities around the world. So I'm showing you an example of what would happen if W88 is dropped in the middle of New York City, and tells you the radius of blast zone and heat zone, as well as the estimated number of casualties and injuries. It will give you a sense of how, again, destructive these nuclear weapons can be. And with the scale of destruction that we're talking about, it is capable of, again, harming human health. At the epicenter, the temperatures are going to be in the tens of millions of degrees. Nothing is going to be survivable at the epicenter. In the area surrounding the epicenter, you'll see flash burns, blindness, and as a result of the shock wave, you'll see barotrauma. And because it is literally destroying all the buildings and infrastructure, all the debris is going to lead to blunt or penetrating trauma. And you'll also have a firestorm, and you'll see the fires just spreading and causing significant burns. Next, again, as I pointed out, radiation as a result of nuclear reactions makes nuclear weapons different from other forms of weapons. And this is particularly important because our body is pretty sensitive to radiation. Specifically, it is the rapidly dividing cells that are sensitive to radiation. Now we have, bone marrow cells, skin cells, gastrointestinal cells. They need to keep replicating themselves to keep us healthy. And in order to do so, they rely on a process called DNA replication. Now, radiation can disrupt the DNAs. And as a result, these cells cannot rely on a proper functioning DNA replication process. So as a result, they will not function, they will die. And that is the foundation for all the health effects that we'll see as a result of radiation exposure. So one is called acute radiation syndrome. And again, as a result of radiation exposure, your bone marrow will fail. You're gonna lose the ability to generate red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And they're important for carrying oxygen in your body, fighting infections, and stop the bleed, respectively. Now, your skin cells need to constantly replicate and generate new cells, but radiation will stop that. So you're going to have hair loss, burns, non-healing wounds. The same thing for the GI tract. You're going to lose that barrier in your GI system, causing nausea, vomiting. You're going to have bloody diarrhea, and you're going to lose a lot of water, causing dehydration. And in severe cases, neurological consequences can happen, like brain swelling, seizure, and coma. Now, exposure to radiation can also lead to chronic effects. We've seen strongest increase in risk increase in cancer development, like leukemia, as well as other solid organ cancers, like breast cancer. Your thyroid can also fail to function as a result of radiation exposure. Radiation can also create a condition called like pro-inflammatory condition, which can lead to a whole host of diseases, namely coronary artery disease, heart valve disease. It can also cause scarring, leading to pulmonary fibrosis and cataracts. Radiation can also cause birth defects, pregnancy loss, and we've seen among the Japanese atomic bombing survivors that there are psychiatric effects as a result of nuclear weapon bombing, such as PTSD, depression, and anxiety. I just wanted to show this graph, which shows the increased risk of cancer among the Japanese atomic bomb survivors. And this graph also shows the increased risk of solid tumors among the Japanese atomic bomb survivor, um, namely in the stomach, colon. Again, these have a lot of rapidly dividing cells in the GI tract, as well as liver, skin, um, urinary bladder, and so forth. And I will pass to Dr. Hodgkin.
Great. Thank you so much, Ghee. And I'll jump right in right where you left off there. Uh, oh, man. Okay, I have to allow, hang on. You know what, Molly, it's not letting me, let me just try again here. Oh, we're good. Okay. All right, can you guys all see this? Okay, great. Well, so good evening or good middle of the night. And so great to see so many friends and colleagues here. And thank you so much, Ghee, for that great presentation. So I'll pick up where Ghee left off here, talking about the global climate, what makes nuclear weapons different from other weapons in terms of their global climate effects and their purpose. So unfortunately, all of the effects that Ghee just laid out are not the only problem with nuclear weapons. We also have this body of data that originates in the 1980s, but has been validated by much more sophisticated climate models in recent decades, showing that when nuclear weapons are used on population centers, the amount of burning injects massive amounts of black carbon into the atmosphere, much of which gets lofted above into the upper troposphere and stratosphere above weather patterns that can clear it. All of this soot in the upper atmosphere absorbs sunlight, decreasing global temperatures and precipitation. And this in turn leads to crop failure, starvation, and epidemic disease. So this graph shows is a sort of a summary of a lot of the modeling of these effects. So on the x-axis, we have millions of tons of soot injected into the upper atmosphere. And on the left side here is the amount of soot injected in a so-called limited nuclear war with only Hiroshima-sized weapons and only hundreds of weapons between India and Pakistan. And then all the way on the right side here, we have a much larger conflict like between Russia and NATO. And on the y-axis here, on the left, we've got percent change in precipitation, and on the right, change in temperature in degrees Celsius. So we can see in this so-called limited nuclear war, we've got a 5 to 10% decrease in precipitation and 1 to 2 degrees decrease in degrees Celsius. And then all the way on the right, more like a 40 to 45% decrease in precipitation and 8 to 9 degrees Celsius decrease in temperature, which is well below the temperatures of the last ice age. And so a paper from the summer of 2022 modeled what the effect of these different scenarios would be on global agriculture and fishery output. Oh, gosh. So here we've got a number of different scenarios with different amounts of soot injected into the atmosphere. And we can see here, so in the smaller so-called limited nuclear war, with 100 weapons used, we've got 255 million people starving to death, versus in the largest scenario, in the US versus Russia, or NATO versus Russia scenario, we've got 5 billion of the 8 billion people on Earth starving to death. So in 1983, the WHO said that nuclear weapons constitute the greatest immediate threat to the health and welfare of mankind, and that's still true today. So next, I want to sort of move into analysis a little bit here to try to answer this question of what are nuclear weapons for, really, anyways? And so nuclear weapons developed in the context of World War II, and there's an argument that's been laid out by Daniel Ellsberg in his book, The Doomsday Machine, as well as others, showing that sort of nuclear weapons were used the way that they were because of this process over the course of World War II of the eroding norm that you don't intentionally bomb civilians. Now, there was intentional bombing of civilians in the Spanish Civil War by Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and also by Japanese forces in the 1930s in China. But at the beginning of World War II, after the German invasion of Poland, the US, UK, and Nazi Germany all put out statements saying that it was wrong and against international law to intentionally bomb population centers. And the intentional bombing of civilian centers to try to attain victory by terrorizing civilian populations is a phenomenon that really escalated over the course of World War II with the Blitz of London, but also by Allied attacks like the fire bombings of Dresden and Tokyo. And so the argument here is that the choice to use nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was only possible as the end result of that, as a culmination of that process and the end result of the degradation of those norms. The picture that you see on the right there is not from the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Actually, that's the aftermath of the firebombing of Tokyo with conventional weapons. So in the Cold War, when the various nuclear armed powers had nuclear weapons and realized that they were not using them and they were spending a lot of money on them, there was a lot of discussion about, oh, surely there must be other uses for these weapons. So actually, both the US and USSR had so-called peaceful nuclear explosions programs in the 50s and 60s, where they were using nuclear explosions for mining or for other geological projects before there was enough public outcry to stop that. And this idea of using nuclear weapons to solve non-military problems, unfortunately, continues to appear to this day. In 2019, Axios leaked that President Trump had this conversation about using nuclear weapons against hurricanes. And actually, just a few weeks ago, former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, proposed ending the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz by opening a new strait with a number of thermonuclear detonations. So these ideas continue to exist. So furthermore, there are these ideas of, well, there's different kinds of nuclear weapons. We've got not just strategic nuclear weapons for going to another country and targeting their cities and their military installations at home, but actually we can use nuclear weapons in the battlefield too, and these are so-called tactical nuclear weapons. So both the American and Russian arsenals have these sort of smaller nuclear weapons that are conceived as being used in a theater of conflict. This has never happened, fortunately, but this idea of using nuclear weapons on the battlefield raises a lot of logical problems, including what kind of a target on a battlefield is so big that it needs kilotons of explosions. And also, if this is a battlefield that you're trying to gain control of, why would you want to contaminate it with radiation? And also, presumably, you have the strategic aims in your war of convincing the international community that you're the good guys and not escalating to apocalypse. And so how can you achieve that by using nuclear weapons on the battlefield? Unfortunately, these are not just theoretical questions that I'm raising, but these are questions that, for example, you can see debated on Russian cable TV. And then finally, another kind of question about the purpose of nuclear weapons that you'll often hear is people say, well, the point of them is not to use them. The point of them is to deter your enemy. But unfortunately, the nature of nuclear weapons is such that if your public position is that you're not going to use nuclear weapons, they no longer deter anything. And so they incentivize the behavior of not just threatening your enemies, but trying to make your threats credible by behaving crazy and brinksmanship and the whole madman theory. And this whole idea that nuclear weapons contribute to peace through deterrence assumes that the only actors are nation states. They assume that everyone is behaving rationally. They assume that command and control is perfect and will continue to be forever. And they assume that such a system is ethically acceptable. And I think there are obvious problems with all of those assumptions. So the reason I bring up these various points is to make the argument that really things are the same as they were in 1945, which is that the only purpose of nuclear weapons is to threaten the mass indiscriminate killing of civilians in population centers. This is how they were initially developed in World War II. Every proposal since then for another purpose for nuclear weapons is transparently absurd. And because this is the only purpose of nuclear weapons, that in itself is a very good reason why they should be singled out as a class of weapons for abolition. And so I'll finish with this quote from Setsuko Thurlow from the 2017 Nobel Prize acceptance speech. "We were not content to be victims. We refused to wait for an immediate fiery end or the slow poisoning of our world. We refused to sit idly in terror as the so-called great powers took us past nuclear dusk and brought us recklessly close to nuclear midnight. We rose up." All right, so that's all I've got for you guys. Thank you so much, and I'll pass it back to Molly.